Well, welcome to this series on burns that we're continuing. Now this is a bit complicated, so you might need to make your own mind map to follow this fully. But how are we going to classify burns is the question and the topic of this video. Now, burns can be superficial. Just involving the top part of the skin, just involving the epidermis. And these are sometimes called first-degree burns. So they can be superficial burns. But if they're a bit deeper, then we get what we call partial thickness burns. And these are affecting part of the thickness of the skin. And these are sometimes called second-degree burns. Now, clinically it's very useful to divide these partial thickness injuries or partial thickness burns into a fairly obvious division: shallow and deep. So the shallow are sometimes called superficial dermal injuries because we're talking about the dermis of the skin, and the deep are burning deeper into the skin. But we'll see precisely what we mean by this shortly. Another classification is full thickness. Full thickness burns, and these are sometimes called third degree. And in full thickness burns, the full thickness of the skin is burnt away and destroyed. And sometimes we talk about fourth classification. These are deep. And these are ones that burn away more than the skin, so they go down to the muscle fascia and into the muscles, or even down into the bones. They are deeper burns, and these are of course sometimes called fourth degree. So that's the bit you've got to understand first, otherwise nothing else will make sense. So burns can be superficial, the first degree. Burns can be partial thickness, the second degree. And remember, we're dividing the partial thickness into shallow and deep. They're both types of partial thickness injury. Burns can be full thickness, the third degree, involving all of the skin, or they can be even deeper than that, so-called fourth degree burns. Now, I think what we need to do now is do a little bit of anatomy and physiology just to make sure we understand what these classifications mean. So let's move on to that. Now, you're probably vaguely familiar with the anatomy of the skin, but we have the surface of the skin there, and the first layer of the skin has a wavy junction between the first layer and the second layer. Then we have usually a thicker second layer, this layer here, and below this we have subcutaneous tissue here, often adipocytes initially, fatty tissue in the subcutaneous area. Beneath that, in a limb for example, deeper down we'll have the muscle fascia underneath that, the coating of the muscle, the fibrous tissue around about the muscle, and below that we'll have the muscle and then the bone. So that's sort of the layers as we go down. So we notice that the top layer of the skin is the epidermis. We notice that the middle layer of the skin, this thicker layer here, from the base of the epidermis, the so-called germinative layer, all the way down to the hypodermis here below. This area is hypodermis. The subcutaneous area. And they are the layers of the skin. And there's some other anatomy it's essential to grasp as well before we go on, to understand the clinical features that we see when we consider how to diagnose different types of burn. And that is that throughout the dermis, so sensory nerve fibres will come in and they'll branch into many branching fibres like this. Apparently blind-ended fibres like this. And these are found throughout the epidermis. But interestingly, they don't actually extend into the epidermis, so they're just in the dermis. Remember, this layer here is the dermis. And these structures that we've drawn here, these sensory neurons, are the nociceptors of the dermis. Now, the nociceptors are sensitive to pain. So at the moment in my fingers, I'm glad to say I have no pain in those fingers. That means the nociceptors are not being activated, they're not being depolarized. They're maintaining a neurological resting potential, but they're not depolarizing, giving rise to pain. It's only when these are injured that there is pain, so if these are cut or rubbed away or burnt, of course, then the nociceptors generate pain. So it's the dermis that contains the nociceptors. Nociceptors are not found in the epidermis, and there are very few nociceptors in the subcutaneous areas as well. The adipose layer is not very sensitive to pain. It's the dermis that's the pain sensitive layer. So that's important to realise. And the other thing it's important to realise is that the dermis is the vascular layer. So here we have the dermis, and this is vascular. Now, there's very few blood vessels in the adipose-based fatty hypodermis. Very few. So if you touch fatty parts of the body, they often feel cooler. There's less blood vessels in the fatty tissues. Fatty tissues are not well perfused with blood. And likewise in the top layer, remember that's the epidermis. In the epidermis there are no blood vessels. The vasculature does not extend into the epidermis. But the dermis is rich in blood vessels. So what we have is arterioles carrying blood into capillary networks. I'm told millions of them in the dermis, draining out via venules in the vascular dermis. So what we have are dermal capillaries, millions of dermal capillaries. The arterioles, of course, taking the blood in. The venules taking the partly deoxygenated blood away. And these are in the dermis, and they're also in the fingernail beds. So what we see is when we apply pressure, let's apply pressure to my fingernail beds here. Right. Apply pressure there. Can you see it's going white? So maybe a bit closer. That's going white, and then as I let go, it's reperfusing. Now that whiteness we call blanching, and the redness going back in we call capillary refill. You can do it anyway. So we press and we get blanching, we let go and we get refill. Now the reason for that is when I'm applying pressure, so when I was applying pressure on the surface of my skin there, that was squeezing the blood out of these capillaries in the dermis. So So the capillaries of the dermis are carrying the red blood cells, the erythrocytes. It's good because it means they're giving oxygen to the dermis, they're taking up the carbon dioxide, they're providing the nutrients, they're taking away the nitrogenous waste products, it's all good. But when we press that, what we're doing is we are pressing the blood out of the capillaries. Basically, we are squeezing the capillaries shut. It only takes a pressure of about 25 millimeters of mercury actually to close off the capillaries. So we're closing them, and when it's white, what we're looking at we're looking at the dermis without the blood in the capillaries. It's blanched, it's white. Then when we let go, the blood pressure pushes the blood back in, and we get the capillary refill. So that's what's going on. Now, these injuries we mentioned, the superficial injuries, are injuries where only the epidermis is affected. So they're only affecting the epidermis. So a superficial injury might be something like that, where just the top part of the epidermis is burnt away. Or they might be slightly deeper, where more epidermis is burnt away. But what we can see here is we've got preserved epidermis here. This will be an area of preserved epidermis. That's still classed as superficial because healing can occur upwards and readily from these areas. Now, if the burn is affecting more of the skin and it's going down to there, can you see now all of the epidermis has been burnt away? That's all burnt away now. And that we would call a superficial partial thickness injury or a partial dermal injury. But if the burn's more severe, it's going to go further down and it's going to burn away a large part of the dermis. And we will call that a deep partial thickness injury. So down to here, if all this is lost here, that would be a deep partial thickness injury or a deep dermal injury. And if all the skin is lost all the way down to the hypodermis, then we would classify that as a full thickness injury, where everything is lost all the way down. So that would be a full thickness injury. And I've actually got a copy of this from the Pathophysiology Notes book that you might be familiar with, where I made a note of that.